computer. All right. Admit all. Is it not letting me? I'm just going to keep. Okay. Welcome to those entering. We're going to try to start our presentation in about 5 minutes. And thank you for showing up early and getting into the program. Mom, I can't talk here. I'm getting ready to do a meeting. Sorry. All right, love you. Bye-bye.
Kathy?
Yes.
Hey, greetings. This is Max.
Hey, Max, how are you doing?
Just looking for my picture.
All right. Well, we're getting ready to start our meeting here in a second. So thanks for joining us tonight.
Well, sure. It sounds interesting. I met you last month, but I forgot about it.
Well, we're good to have you.
Okay. I see you have tips for today's presentations.
Yes. So I'm going to talk about those because I'm getting ready to start.
Okay. I'm going to just, I'm going to go on mute and listen to what you say.
That'd be great. All right, greetings to everybody that's here. We're going to try to start on time. I still have people coming in to our waiting room, and I will be admitting them, but I want to thank you all. My name is Kathy Hicks, and if you haven't seen me before, I'm the president of the Arlington Historical Society, and we've been extremely fortunate that we have been able to continue to deliver our online or our programs, our monthly programs, just doing it virtually. So we are thrilled that you have signed up and registered. We think this is a very interesting program tonight and a topic that certainly is very current. So we appreciate you joining us. There's just a couple of reminders. We want to give our speaker our best attention. So I'm really going to ask that you make sure that you are muted throughout the entire presentation. Make sure your video is turned off, and then utilize that chat feature if you have questions. We will be monitoring the chat feature, and we will be making sure that everybody's questions get answered. And then at the end of the presentation, when we're chatting and having some question and answer, there'll be an opportunity for you to unmute. But we want to make sure that our speaker's not distracted by noises and videos. So we're asking that you follow those considerations. And with that, I am going to take my slide down, and I'm going to turn this over to Jessica Kaplan, one of our many volunteers who works on the programs, and she will be introducing our great speaker tonight.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I am very pleased this evening to introduce an old friend and colleague of mine, Denise Meringolo. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where she's taught for about 15 years. She specializes in public history and is the author of a great read, Museums, Monuments, and National Parks, Toward a New Genealogy of Public History. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Denise and give her the floor.
Okay, let me fumble with technology for 2 seconds. Here we go. All right. Okay, so thank you all so much for coming today. I know this is a topic that is on your minds, and so my goal is to speak for about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit less, and so that we have plenty of time for questions. I want to say that why I think it's important to note that I'm a public historian, and that is that traditional historical practice tends to privilege the individual, right? It's all about individual research, which results in a single authored book published by an academic press. But I was drawn to public history, and particularly to community-based public history practice, because I tend to value collaboration. So in the kind of public history that I do, you've got historians, you've got a variety of stakeholders, you've got all kinds of audiences and others who are really working together to identify historical questions that have immediacy and relevance to them, and to a self-identified community. And I also value dialogue as a vehicle for arriving at a collaborative interpretation of historical evidence. I believe our primary goal as public historians very often is to build empathy, to identify a useful and usable past, and to foster curiosity. So my goal for this talk is kind of twofold. I want to provide you with a philosophical approach and a historical methodology, which can serve as the foundation for the conversations you're having right now about the names of places and monuments and memorials on Arlington's commemorative landscape. And my hope ultimately is that what I'm doing here is helping you as a community engage in a productive dialogue and to arrive at decisions that are equitable and just. So one disclaimer is that throughout this talk, it's really likely that I'm probably going to default to using the word monument or memorial. It's just kind of habit. But my own interests in scholarship tend to emphasize preserved places like historic sites rather than named places like schools or roads. That said, the philosophical approach and the interpretive framework that I'm going to share with you can be applied more broadly to help you consider the future of place names as well as the names of historic sites. And then any examples I'm going to give should be understood as case studies so that they're designed to reveal both the complexity of the issues at hand and the value of the framework that I'll share. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased to have been asked by my friend Jessica, and I'm hoping that we'll have lots to talk about at the end of the talk. So, as I said in my introduction, I tend to value collaboration and dialogue as modes of inquiry, interpretation, and knowledge production in the realm of public history. And that is really challenging work, and it requires a very solid philosophical foundation. And there's kind of two pillars to that. This slide is pillar one. So the first philosophical pillar rests on the question, what is the truth? What are we trying to get at as public historians and as people engaged in public history? This slide kind of indicates that there's four realms of truth telling. And I first learned about this concept of there being four truths when I attended a dialogic interpretation workshop that was led by Braden Painter. Braden Painter is the director of methodology and practice at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. That is a global network of historic sites, memorials, archives, museums that are all united by a shared commitment to promote and protect human rights. And they do this by actively working against the pressure to forget the unpleasant aspects of the past, and by facilitating dialogue among people with different perspectives on both the past and the present. Many of the sites in this network directly challenge official state narratives and commonly held myths about the past. So for example, they include a number of sites in Argentina that memorialize, document, and honor the tens of thousands of people who disappeared under state-sponsored terrorism in Argentina between 1976 and 1993. As you may imagine with that example, most of the sites in this network are documenting and representing histories that are fairly traumatic, that are really difficult to talk about. So they include, for example, death camp and concentration camp sites in Germany. They include sites in the United States where people of Japanese descent were interned during World War II, sites of this nature, historic places with difficult pasts. The coalition promotes and provides training for this dialogic interpretation that rests on this concept of the four truths. And the other important thing about this concept of the four truths is that the idea originated and has been adapted from the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took shape in South Africa after the formal end of apartheid. And it's since been used in other places where there's a need to reconstitute civic life in the wake of policies of forced assimilation or after a civil war or even after acts of genocide. So the essential foundation of this model, and the reason it's useful for public history, is that it insists that there cannot be dialogue and there cannot be reconciliation without truth telling. Because there can't be any unity without a full accounting of loss and trauma. So just to summarize what these four truths are, and this is the way that I kind of think about them, is that the basis of this whole model is that there is such a thing as forensic truth. And that is the kind of truth that is measurable, that is provable, for which we have documentation. There is evidence that I can show you. There are texts in archives. There are oral histories. So before you can establish that you're going to enter into dialogue, you have to agree to these forensic truths. So for example, if you were visiting a site that's associated with the Holocaust and you want to have a meaningful dialogue, you probably can't do it if there's Holocaust deniers there, right? Because they are not agreeing to the forensic truths. Once you've established forensic truth as the foundation, the next thing that you want to get to are these personal truths. And this is where different perspectives on an event can come to light. So you allow people to talk about their personal firsthand experience around a historic event, their direct connections to the historic event that you're talking about, the emotions that that event calls up for them, and how it has impacted their personal identity. And the goal here is to let everyone speak those truths and to listen intently to them. The complicated part, like this is sort of all we can kind of agree to this piece, that there are measurable truths that we can agree to and that there are different perspectives on the past. The hard part is that very often historic places, memorial sites are connected to a collective memory or a group identity or a national identity. And sometimes those are based as much on values and beliefs and presumptions as they are on forensic truths. So the way I think of this is, once we've kind of established forensic truths and listened to personal truths, what might happen in a fruitful dialogue is that you begin to recognize that some of the things that you hold on to as your beliefs don't really jive once you listen to people's personal experiences. And so you have to enter into a reflective moment where you take seriously people's truths and then try to reconcile them with your values or beliefs that you have associated with a particular place. The goal then is ultimately, it could be that you can reconcile all of these truths and arrive at a new sense of collective identity. That doesn't always work. And what might happen is that you can arrive at mutual understanding and empathy and peace, even if there are certain things that you don't want to let go of because they are your values and beliefs. And so you can kind of reconcile all these pieces, even if there are places where you disagree. So for me, for communities to enter into a discussion about the future of place names or memorials or historic sites, they really have to ground those discussions in a critical awareness and active use of these four kinds of truths. And it works best if you've got kind of a facilitator who can pay attention to the ways in which different forms of truth telling are being activated in a particular dialogue. So that's pillar one of my public history practice. The second philosophical pillar to guide a dialogue around monuments rests on the question, what do monuments do? What do these places do? What does it matter that a place is named after a certain person or a school bears a particular name? A common refrain from people who are reluctant to change the names of places or remove monuments is that doing so will erase history. So their presumption then is that history is what monuments do. And this is actually a misunderstanding, because monuments and place names have a history, but they do not necessarily convey or communicate a history of the thing that they are representing. In fact, people do not learn history from monuments or school names. And I've had a really interesting time in recent months talking about places like this with young people. And very often they're unaware that a statue they've passed every day is representing a certain thing, or that the name of their school is an individual that maybe did some stuff that they wouldn't be proud of. They really are not learning history from these place names or monuments. Instead, what's important is that a monument's history really lies in the process, conditions, and context under which that monument was created. One of my favorite historians of commemoration is a professor named Edward T. Linenthal. And he said, quote, "Choices about who and what gets remembered, where acts of remembrance take place, and how we express the significance of acts of remembrance is as much or more about the future as it is about the past." So when we're thinking about monuments, we're thinking as much about who we feel like we are right now and who we want to be in the future as we are about the past. So if monuments do not convey history, what do they do? What is their function? So on a very basic level, the function of monuments is to commemorate some event or individual and to elevate that event or individual in significance. And in doing so, they actually tend to reduce the complexity of the past by overemphasizing particular events or particular people. Monuments create heroes. Monuments mark sites of national tragedy, but they often do so without actually engaging in the history of that tragedy. Monuments make statements about shared values, and they represent ideas about collective identity. And they stand in public places in order to influence people's ideas about what we think is important and who we think we are. Monuments assert power and communicate with authority. They are not easily or naturally translated into sites of dialogue without significant effort and active, constant interpretation. And most importantly, because memorialization is an assertion of power regarding what matters and who gets to decide, memorials can also create and enforce silence. And this is another Edward T. Linenthal idea. But when we make decisions about what to remember and who to turn into a hero, we are also actively making decisions about what and who to forget. And decisions about forgetting have the effect of silencing those whose memories do not align or experiences do not align with the official memory embodied in a monument. Now, when silenced truths, whether those are forensic truths or personal truths, reemerge, when silence is broken, they may appear as controversial or irrelevant because they are directly challenging a memorial's authority and messaging. And I think that that sort of philosophically is something really important to keep in mind. So if you accept my two philosophical pillars, that truth is the foundation of unity, and that there are four kinds of truth that could be involved in any kind of productive dialogue, and that monuments communicate values and assert authority, then on the basis of those two pillars, we can actually start to become more critical and analytical readers of the monument landscape. So monuments are actually not the final word, they're pieces of evidence, they're primary sources. And you can analyze them the same way you would analyze any other kind of primary source. So the questions that are on the screen here come from a syllabus that's called Interviewing Monuments that was developed by the Heart of the Civil War Heritage Area in Maryland. And these questions serve as a guide for recognizing monuments as primary sources, for actually ferreting out what the history of any given monument might be, and for interrogating their significance. So roughly using these questions as a guide, what I'm going to do now is walk you through a reading of Confederate monuments and symbols that I hope will serve as a model and a case study for you as you go forward in similar efforts in Arlington County. So I know this is kind of hard to read, unfortunately, but the very first question you need to ask when you're thinking about the history of a monument is when. When was a monument built or constructed? Because that's really important. So, because it gives you a sense of the historical, social, cultural context in which a particular place name got labeled onto something or a particular statue was put in public space. So this timeline is one that you can access. You can see on the bottom that it's from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's readily available. But what I really want to walk you through here is what this timeline tells us about the context in which the majority of Confederate memorialization was taking place. So as you can see, on the sort of far left-hand side of the screen, if you're facing this picture, that the Southerners really began honoring the Confederacy with statues and other symbols almost immediately after the Civil War ended. And these very early efforts were mostly focused on burying the dead and comforting those left behind. So understandable in the wake of a war that that's your first impulse, right? But they also included a few important symbolic actions. So for example, the first Confederate Memorial Day was established by the wife of a Confederate soldier in 1866. And that same year, Jefferson Davis laid the cornerstone of the Confederate Memorial Monument in a prominent spot on the state capitol grounds in Montgomery, Alabama. So there's plenty of stuff that's happening in the immediate aftermath of the war. But you can also see quite clearly that there's a very significant spike right in the middle of this graph. And then there's a few other spikes that follow. And these are spikes where there's a marked increase in the dedication of Confederate monuments and the display of Confederate symbols. This very first one, that big one right in the middle of the screen, first began really around 1900. during the period in which states were really enacting and enforcing Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised Black voters and segregated every aspect of social life in the South. And you'll see that that spike lasts until the 1920s. And this is important because this period between 1900 and 1920, and certainly 1914 to 1920, is marked by an elevated form of American nationalism. So at first, in the aftermath, after Reconstruction, after 1877, we turn towards, we have to reunify as a country, and there's a little bit of a period of growth of those monuments then. And then between 1914 and 1920, you are seeing the kind of nationalism that took shape as America is deciding to enter into World War I. Now, since the United States shifted from a policy of isolationism to a policy of engagement fairly quickly. I mean, Woodrow Wilson won re-election with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And then he had to turn around right away and say, oh, we actually have to join this war effort. So there was a huge public relations campaign to turn public opinion pretty rapidly in favor of the war. And as part of that, this phrase 100% Americanism was used in a variety of settings to make a distinction between somebody who was very patriotic and somebody who was not patriotic. And that phrase 100% Americanism was used to support the draft, to support the jailing of conscientious objectors, and to justify the deportation of political radicals, among other things. Now, it's not accidental that this period also saw a rapid resurgence of the KKK. In its earlier iteration, the KKK was really a Southern institution, somewhat isolated in the South. But during this period of time in the 1920s, it became kind of mainstream, and it rebranded itself and its effort to enforce white supremacy as 100% Americanism. And members of the KKK like won public office in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and places like that. So the reason I mention this is that it's not accidental or innocent that this is also a period of massive Confederate monument and Confederate symbolism being placed at courthouses, at state houses, on public landscapes. The second spike, might not surprise you, is really beginning in the early 1950s and lasting through the 1960s. Because why? We're seeing an increasing success of the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education happened in 1954. There's a backlash, as we well know, among segregationists. And it's during this period, again, that a large number of Confederate monuments are dedicated on the battlefield at Gettysburg. It's also when the Confederate flags began to wave atop Southern state houses. So again, it's another reaction to change that we see Confederate iconography gaining in popularity. You can also see from this that by the 1970s, the activity of Confederate memorialization is slowing down significantly, but it didn't stop entirely. And the map is showing you that it continues into the turn of the 21st century. Now, I want to be very clear that alongside the efforts to memorialize the Confederacy, there was always resistance. It's not as if this happened and no one complained about it and no one had any questions about it. There was always resistance. Among the resistance were Black women's organizations who were vocal opponents to mounting more and more Confederate monuments. A lot of Confederate figures were very controversial subjects of public art. And so there were debates that happened in newspapers in the South and elsewhere. But it's also true that the movement to start to take down and change these monuments really didn't gain meaningful public support until very recently in our history. So when the modern iteration of the civil rights movement began to expand in visibility and effectiveness, beginning around 2015, that's when we start to see these monuments coming down. So the when is really telling in terms of the history of monuments.
Denise, can you tell us
Yes,
what geographic area that graph covers?
that graph is the entire United States.
Okay.
There's
Um,
another graph coming that is literally mapped on a map. That's just the timeline.
Okay, and do you know how many items are represented by each circle in that?
It's probably says on the graph, but I don't know that off the top of my head. I do know that the number still standing, I'm probably going to end up repeating myself, is something like 1,700
Okay,
still present on the landscape right now.
thanks. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks for asking a question. So the next question we want to ask is who? All right, we know when, we know in what context. The next question is who. So the organization that's really most responsible for establishing Confederate monuments in the United States is the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And when I'm talking about this, I need to give credit where credit is due. And there's a professor by the name of Dr. Karen Cox, C-O-X. She's a professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. She's really written the definitive history of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It's called Dixie's Daughters. And she's also written a number of essays and editorials about Confederate monuments. She's been interviewed extensively, particularly since 2017. So you could do a quick search to find short form versions of her research online in a variety of formats. So I'm drawing heavily on her work when I tell you that the UDC was founded in 1894, and it quickly became the most popular of all the Southern white women's organizations. Its membership was drawn mainly from the middle and upper classes, and its membership peaked at 100,000 at the beginning of World War I, right when that tremendous growth is going to start happening with Confederate monument construction. The UDC's members advanced and popularized what's generally called the lost cause myth about the origins and meanings of the Civil War. So the idea of the lost cause probably contains some arguments and debates that you still hear in popular culture. So for example, it insists that Confederate soldiers were fighting for a noble and just set of aims, such as independence and states' rights. It also utterly dismisses the idea that slavery was a central issue of the war. Those are tenets of the lost cause that were advanced by this organization and others like it in the 20th century. So with this belief system as justification, the UDC really committed itself to vindicating the Confederate generation, both the men who fought and the women who supported the cause. UDC members became prominent and well-known figures in their communities across the South through a mix of political and symbolic actions. And their agenda included collecting and preserving pro-Confederate histories, collecting and preserving artifacts, preserving sites associated with the Confederacy, including Jefferson Davis's home in Richmond, engaging in various forms of public commemoration, including pageants and parades and holidays, and lobbying for the establishment of Confederate homes for soldiers, widows, and their descendants. The other really interesting thing is that the UDC also exerted tremendous influence in K-12 education. So according to Dr. Cox, the UDC had a multi-pronged approach. It involved going into schools, putting up battle flags, putting up portraits of generals. It meant getting schools renamed for famous Confederates. It meant influencing textbooks. It meant creating what was called the Children of the Confederacy, which was their formal youth auxiliary, so that they could then draw membership from those children when they became adults. And children were always involved in the unveiling of monuments. They would select one child to pull the cord, and then there'd be cheers when the monument was unveiled. And the children in the stands would form what was called a living battlefield, and they sang Southern patriotic songs. So this is a very immersive experience and a formative experience for many of children in the South. And think about that for a moment. The UDC was so successful that there are several generations of Southerners and others who don't simply just believe the lost cause, but they learned about it. They learned about it in school, and they learned about it at events like that. When it comes to the commemorative landscape, the UDC is directly responsible for more than 700 monuments and other memorials to the Confederacy on the American landscape, far more than any other group or organization. It's also important to note that very recently the group has started, because they still exist, has started to shift its rhetoric a little bit. So after the rally Unite the Right in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, where the counter-protester Heather Heyer was killed, the UDC issued a statement, which is now featured prominently on its website, that says it totally denounces any individual or group that promotes racial divisiveness or white supremacy. And we call on these people to stop using Confederate symbols for their abhorrent and reprehensible purposes. The second group that's responsible for constructing monuments and popularizing Confederate symbols is the Sons of Confederate Veterans. That group was formed in 1896, and it's important to note that they remain far less circumspect about their position and far more overt in their defense of the Confederacy. So that group's website says they are, quote, preserving the history and legacy of Confederate heroes so that future generations can understand the motives that animated the Southern cause. And in case there's any doubt about what they mean by these motives, the website features a 1929 pamphlet called A Confederate Catechism, which denies that slavery or secession were causes of the war and asserts that enslaved Black people were, quote, the most spoiled domestics in the world. And I need to credit a historian by the name of Kevin Levin, who has written a great deal about the Confederacy and particularly the myth of Black Confederates. And he's the one who pointed out the website to me. So we've gone through when and who. The next question, getting at Jessica's question, is how many? So I have to say that we're asking how many because what we want to know is how influential is a set of ideas and how often is it represented on the commemorative landscape. This is a really bad screenshot of what is actually a really cool interactive map that is also on the website of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And you'll notice that there's different colors on those markers because they represent different things. Some of them are the names of a school, some of them are an actual monument. Some of them might be like just a Confederate symbol. So you can actually go in there and play with the map a little bit to see exactly what the numbers represent. But what I want to point out is that you can see on this map that the majority of these Confederate monuments and symbols are indeed in the southern portion of the United States, but the South includes states like Maryland and Kentucky, which were actually did not secede during the Civil War. They were border states. In both those cases, they did have economies that were dependent on slave labor. That meant that their state legislatures during the war were at best divided. In both of those cases, they were heated battlegrounds over the issue of slavery in the 1850s. And again, over the issue of civil rights in the decades after the war. But now they've kind of become part of the mythologizing of the South through the commemorative landscape. You'll also notice that there are some Confederate monuments in places that you're like, why are they there? Out in California, up in Massachusetts, in New York, in Maine. Strange places for these symbols to exist. Since the June of 2015, when a white supremacist murdered 9 people in Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina, about 120 symbols have been removed. This includes 49 monuments and 4 flags and name changes for 36 schools, 7 parks, 3 buildings, and 9 roads. Those numbers might have increased slightly since I wrote this talk a little while ago, but not by much. It's still within just a few here and there. Among the things that were removed was the Confederate battle flag that had flown at the South Carolina State Grounds in Columbia. It also includes the Confederate monuments in New Orleans and Baltimore, both of which were removed by the mayors of those cities. However, 1,740 Confederate symbols still stand. This includes 772 monuments. More than 300 of those are in Georgia, Virginia, and North Carolina. There are 105 public schools named for Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and other Confederate icons. There are 80 counties and cities that are named for Confederates. There are 9 observed holidays in 5 states, and there are 10 US military bases that are named for Confederates. So this is a widespread process of naming and commemoration that has really influenced what we think we stand for and what we think the war and the history of the Civil War is about. The other important thing that I've sort of already said, but I just want to highlight, is that it's important to think about where these things exist. So I've already said that they are in places associated with official authority, right? It's not an accident that they're at courthouses and state houses, because these were acts of authority put in place during a time when white people were staking a claim to those kinds of places. They're also on public school buildings, military bases, national and state parks. At one point, there were 11 Confederate statues on display in National Statuary Hall collection at the US Capitol building. And as you likely know, each state can commission 2 statues to represent themselves. And I believe there are 6 remaining. And I think they are 2 from Mississippi, 1 from South Carolina, 1 from Georgia, 1 from North Carolina, and 1 from Alabama. Up until about a month ago, Virginia still had a statue of Robert E. Lee that represented the state of Virginia in Statuary Hall, but it will be replaced, it has been removed, and it will be replaced by a statue of civil rights activist Barbara Johns at some point in the near future. I believe she's going to be the second African-American woman with a state commissioned statue in Statuary Hall. The first, at least intended one, is Mary McLeod Bethune, who has replaced or is scheduled to replace one of Florida's removed Confederate statues. And I think it's important to think about what it means to have Confederate statues in the US Capitol and what that might represent. So here's one little tiny case study very quickly. There are many other Confederate statues, sites, street names, symbols on display prominently in cities and small towns. And here's my local example, because even though I teach at UMBC, I live in Alexandria, Virginia. So this is Appomattox, and you may be familiar with it. It stood in Old Town on Washington Street where it intersects Prince Street. So if you were driving down Prince Street toward the river, you actually had to drive around it. It was right in the middle of the intersection. Appomattox is a 7-foot tall bronze statue originally dedicated in 1889 to honor Alexandria's Confederate dead. And it's at that location because that is the site where 800 Alexandria troops mustered out on May 24th, 1861 to fight for the Confederacy. The names of more than 100 Confederate dead from Alexandria are engraved on the granite base, and the sculptor based his design on a soldier in the battlefield, in a battlefield painting of the same name. So this was a symbol that was well known to observers of Confederate iconography. The Robert E. Lee Camp of Confederate Veterans commissioned the statue, and it is owned to this day by the Mary Custis Lee 17th Virginia Regiment chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. The finished statue was so well received that replicas began popping up throughout the South, and the Robert E. Lee Camp applied for and received a copyright for the design in 1892. The Robert E. Lee Camp also lobbied for and won legislation in the 1890 Virginia House of Delegates that prevented the statue from ever being moved. And additional legislation was passed in the Virginia House in 1950 and then renewed and updated several times as recently as 2010 to strengthen the law. The statute is titled Memorials for War Veterans, and it reads in part, quote, "It shall be unlawful for the authorities of the locality or any other person or persons to disturb or interfere with any monuments or memorials so erected, or to prevent its citizens from taking proper measures and exercising proper means for the protection, preservation, and care of the same." And this law also includes a very clear definition of what it means to disturb or interfere with. And what is included in, what is illegal in terms of disturbing or interferes with, includes the placement of Union markings or monuments on previously designated Confederate memorials, or the placement of Confederate markings or monuments on previously designated Union memorials. So you cannot recontextualize these things by putting them in sort of dialogue with one another. It's literally against Virginia law to do so. Now, the city of Alexandria actually made multiple requests to the UDC to remove the statue. There had been a vote, people in the city wanted it removed, but it was illegal for the city to remove the statue. So no action was taken since the first time they asked in 2016 and until 2020. In the meantime, in the city of Alexandria, after the murders at Mother Emanuel Church, the city stopped a tradition of flying the Confederate flag at Washington and Prince Streets on Lee's birthday and on Confederate Memorial Day. The city removed a painting of Robert E. Lee from Alexandria City Hall. They renamed the stretch of Route 1 running through Alexandria. It's now Richmond Highway. It used to be Jefferson Davis Highway. And just last summer, when the Black Lives Matter protests began again, the UDC quietly removed this statue. It just was like one day it was gone. And now for a little while, the base remained, but even that's gone. So there's actually no evidence anymore that the statue was there, but the UDC had to remove it because the UDC is the owners of the statue. And it's important to note that there are a lot of jurisdictions and a lot of states that have similar laws making it illegal for an individual or a municipality to remove Confederate monuments or any other military monument. So what about Arlington? What does any of this have to do with Arlington? In Arlington, Lee's name is also everywhere. So what might happen if you were to adopt this kind of process of analyzing and questioning the history of each incident of Lee's name? For example, should the house in Arlington Cemetery bear the name of Robert E. Lee Memorial? Is Lee's association with that house the most important aspect of its history? As a historian, I might suggest that it's not the most important aspect of the house. During and in the immediate aftermath of the war, the site meant something else entirely. It was confiscated by the federal government and occupied by Union soldiers. Its grounds became a community, a sprawling freedmen's village where about 1,500 people who had followed Union troops built houses, churches, cultivated farmland. I read an article in Smithsonian Magazine which quoted a visiting journalist from 1867 who said, "One sees more than poetic justice in the fact that its rich lands, so long the domain of the great general of the rebellion, now afford labor and support to hundreds of enfranchised slaves." And of course, the land around that house was the first to be used to bury soldiers, and it was really neither accident nor convenience that led Lee's property to be chosen. It was a conscious act of authority, power, and symbolism. The first soldiers were buried there in May of 1864, and the practice was made official in June of 1864, when General Montgomery Meigs wrote, "I recommend that the land surrounding the Arlington Mansion, now understood to be the property of the United States, be appropriated as a national military cemetery." And that meaning was not lost on observers. A comment in the Washington Morning Chronicle read, quote, "This and the Freedmen's Village are righteous uses of the estate of the rebel General Lee." As for Lee Highway, from what I can gather, Lee Highway stretches or used to stretch across several states along an old railroad route, and many portions of the road have already been renamed, much like portions of Route 1. Interestingly, Lee Highway officially got its name in 1922 during that peak in UDC activity. And similarly, the official effort to restore the Lee House began in 1925. The Robert E. Lee memorial name was not official until 1972, and there's a pretty long period of time where it was called the Custis Lee Mansion. The use of the word mansion is a whole other question and problem that we can maybe solve for another day, because I assume the land was actually a plantation. So as you are considering the renaming of these and other places in Arlington County, I only hope that you will consider these kinds of questions and move forward with a dialogue that's centered on a critical awareness of the kinds of truths that people bring to sites like that. So thank you so much for your attention. I feel the need to credit people. So here's a whole list of credits of places that I went to while writing this talk. And I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any comments you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I'm going to start out with a question. What do you think is the most insidious monument left in this area right now?
Oh, I don't know if I know the answer to that question.
It's just your point of view.
Yeah. You know, this is such a Professor Dodge, but I don't know if I have an answer to that question. But I will tell you that I often wonder, like, are we still a nation that wants to memorialize and build monuments? And if so, what will that look like in the future? Like, is there another approach we could take if we want to maintain a process of memorialization? And might we consider moving away from memorializing individuals and instead think about building spaces that are actually better suited to dialogue and debate than authority making and statement making? So I'm sure, like, tomorrow I'm going to think, oh, I should have said that monument, but right this second I can't actually think of one.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions from the group.
There's a question.
Okay, here we go. Tracy Hopkins asks, what are your thoughts about the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery?
So I will say that I wonder if there's a difference between places where people are buried, because I believe the Confederate, like, there are Confederate burials that were moved inside Arlington Cemetery. I feel like I'm a little bit out of my depth, but I think that is correct. And I feel like maybe there's a difference between people who have died and are buried, and there are memorials to them. Then there's a difference between that and memorializing a general as a symbol of some kind of set of values. So in the context of the cemetery, I don't have as strong feelings, but I just think, if we make it a little bit more abstract, is it strange that we have accepted, well, no. I mean, I think it's strange to think about that the Confederacy was actually a rebellion against the nation and an effort to tear the nation down. And it does seem strange to put alongside symbols to the nation to integrate back in that history as if it is not a history of, a coup, basically, to try to overturn the nation. I just have questions about it. I don't know that I'm going to take a strong stand about it.
So Jessica, a question was sent to me, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it.
Oh, okay.
Somebody asked and said, do you know of an example of a site that illustrates a reconciliatory truth?
A Confederate site in particular?
No, just an example of a site that illustrates that.
Well, so there's a bunch of them in the US that actually are part of the that coalition that practices that kind of reconciliation dialogue. And I think Manzanar National Historic Site, which was a Japanese internment camp, has actually won awards for its role in facilitating dialogue about internment. The other one actually is Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. There's a fantastic book about that site that was written by a historian named Ari Kalman. What's really significant about that is it's the first national park site that's called a massacre site and not a battlefield. And the process by which that site came to be interpreted as a massacre site is a true demonstration of how this kind of dialogic interpretation can work, because participants in the interpretation of the site were tribal peoples who were descendants of the original indigenous people who were murdered there. They were Park Service rangers, they were professional historians, they were actually local people in Colorado who had strong feelings and attachments to the landscape. They were military units. So there was an entire multi-year process that went into establishing that park and its interpretive framework. So that's a fantastic book. It's called The Misplaced Massacre. It's it's like a public history book that maybe sounds like it could be boring, but it reads like a novel. It's really, really good.
Sounds wonderful. Okay, Karen Connor asks, what about historical markers that designate a historical event happened, i.e. a plaque and cannons that stood in Fairfax County? They were taken down because they indicated that the first Confederate died there. If it were a Union man, I suspect it would still be up today. What do you think?
I mean, so historic markers is a whole other really interesting conversation, because there's another book by James Lowen called Lies Across America, where he goes through historic sites and historic markers that are just flatly false. And it's actually a very entertaining book. Like, people who put up markers and, the history is flatly false. So, I kind of the general opinion that permanence is a problem. Anytime you put something up and intend for it to be permanent, that seems kind of strange. Here's maybe a way for me to get at this question is this, where I don't know if you guys know Fort Ward Park in Alexandria. It is one of the natural forts that was ringing the city during the Civil War. It's actually an even older fort than that, but it was used during the Civil War as part of the protection of the Capitol. And for a long time, all the signage was here's a trench that was built by the Union forces that used this fort. Here's whatever, here's the general's quarters that were reconstructed in whatever year, and you can peek through the window. And I gotta tell you, I'm a historian, and I was like, I don't care, so what does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's like trenches and warfare and battle lines and cannons and the first shot and all that stuff. Those are maybe facts, but I don't know what they tell me about what happened here or why it's important. And in the past few years, a whole new set of signs went up in that park, because what I didn't know was that site had, similar to Arlington Cemetery site, been a place where camp following enslaved people moving out of slavery into freedom following Union troops had established a community on that landscape. So there was a cemetery there, there were homes there were agricultural fields there. I didn't know that. And that story is so much more interesting to me and speaks so much more to what the war was about than battle lines and cannons. So I'm only speaking for myself sort of personally, but I think that is the broader question, is when we put up a sign to mark a thing, are we thinking about why we think it's important for people to know that?
Yeah. Okay. Sean Deniston asks what he says may seem like a cynical question, but shouldn't people need to face uncomfortable facts than feel you can remove things when you don't like them?
Oh, that's so interesting though. But the whole point of I mean, it's sort of vague, so I'm not exactly sure which things he's talking about. But if we're talking about Confederate memorials, those things were put up in order to avoid uncomfortable facts. And they were put up to silence uncomfortable truths. And now I don't know that people are saying they don't want to face those truths. I think they are saying that those sites are memorializing something that is untrue and are continuing to misdirect the discussion, right? Because we end up discussing, oh, but the Civil War was significant and that general was actually a nice guy. I don't think that's the point of the memorial, right? The point of the memorial, depending on where it is and how big it is and how imposing it is to silence uncomfortable truths. And that's, I think, the problem with some, and when I'm really talking about these, you know, large scale general on a horse kind of monuments, it's kind of hard to speak back to those. So I do agree that simply removing it is not entering into dialogue, but for me, one thing to consider is that it might just be a gesture to changing the course of civic dialogue going forward.
Okay. Wow, complex. These are really complex issues.
I know, I'm unprepared to answer all these
History is a
questions.
very messy topic.
Yes,
History is
it is.
messy.
Okay, this is a really good question from Isra Al-Mashadani, and I'm sorry if I got your last name wrong. Did the Union commemorate Union military leaders' statues the same way Confederates did in the South?
Oh, that's so interesting. I'm sure they did. Don't know the answer to that question. But for example, here's one way into answering that question. And that is that Lincoln was a divisive figure for a really long time. So sure, we have the Lincoln Memorial. It seems like obvious that we have the Lincoln Memorial, but that didn't go up. I feel like that, I didn't look this up ahead of time. I feel like it was also the 1920s. And there was, I could be wrong. Somebody could probably Google it and find the right date right now. But it took a really long time to decide to put up the Lincoln Memorial. And they were really worried about how to portray Lincoln. And so the sort of interpretation of Lincoln changes over time too, so that he becomes like a troubled figure. You notice how his posture is in Lincoln, in the Lincoln Memorial. He's sitting in a chair with his head heavy, right? He's portrayed as someone with a lot on his mind, as like a problematic figure with not a heroic figure. And there's really interesting books. I wish I could think of a title off the top of my head of just about Lincoln and the memorialization of Lincoln. So there's that. Then, you know, there's a beautiful memorial in Massachusetts to the Massachusetts 54th, which some of you might know because of the movie Glory. But that is a really stunning memorial where, yes, it's actually a relief, you know, so it's not like a statue of a man on a horse, but it's a relief that shows many figures. And the artist actually brought African-American models into his studio so that every face of one of the Black troops would be an individual. And it is a monument to the Union and to the Union cause. That is really pretty stunning. And I'm sure there are sort of the same kind of monumental dude on a horse statues, but I just don't know that history.
There are several even here in DC.
Yeah.
Thomas Circle has
That's true,
General
yeah.
Thomas. And
right? And like how many young people walk past those statues and they're like, oh, well, clearly that guy was a Union general. They don't, I'm sure they don't know. It's just to my point, like they walk past the statues all the time and they recognize them as conveying something about strength, but they probably don't know who the guy on the horse is. In either case, on either side.
Right. Okay, Jason Tibbetts, who just chimed in, had a question. Are there any renamings or removals that you feel weren't justified?
You know, so not yet. I don't think so. Again, I'm kind of in this phase as a human, not even necessarily as a public historian, that I just kind of wonder if we're entering into a new period where we're going to tear them all down and start from scratch and sort of figure out what we want the landscape to look like. I know there has been talk of renaming and or taking down statues that are figures like George Washington or whatever, people like that who were slaveholders, but perhaps not as, I don't know the right word to use, who we do hold to be quote unquote founding fathers, right? They weren't, he wasn't fighting on the other guy's side, he was ours. And there has been talk about that. And there's been some worry about it, but I guess my thought is, I'm kind of in a wait and see mode because I think there's just something changing and I don't necessarily think that change is bad. I will tell you that my son is a graduate of T.C. Williams High School and they are renaming T.C. Williams High School because T.C. Williams was a superintendent of schools who actively fought integration. And I don't understand, I literally can't find out what was the process of naming the school that was built for integration after a segregationist. Like, I don't know if they were trying to be defiant to integration or if they were like trying to insult the segregationist. I really don't know, but they've just decided to not use that name anymore. And it's been really interesting to listen to the discussion about that, because what's also true is that kids who went to that school feel attached to the name. We have the movie, Remember the Titans, and people are like, but the movie, and everyone knows T.C. Williams because of Remember the Titans. And so people did not realize the history of that person. Again, they didn't teach that in school. Nobody knew who he was. It just became the name of the school. And people felt really strongly about changing the name. And some students said, listen, this doesn't change anything. There's still plenty of inequality within the school system. There's plenty of inequality within T.C. Williams, within the high school, excuse me. I think we're now calling it Alexandria High School. And it doesn't change anything. And I understand that perspective. But for me, I've always felt that a symbolic gesture is just a symbolic gesture, but symbolism matters. So to me, it's the first step. And then hopefully you can use it as a platform to do other work.
Right, and we recently changed Washington and Lee to Washington and Liberty,
Right.
In Arlington.
Right.
Okay.
Well, sorry to interrupt again, but you addressed my other question about founding fathers. But since we're talking about high schools, I'm over in Falls Church City, just over the border. And of course, we did just vote to change the name of George Mason High School. So this is a founding father, obviously died well before the Civil War, but it's being named because of its association, you know, with being a slave owner, not because of the fact that he wrote the Virginia Bill of Rights. So yeah, I'm just wondering what your take is on that.
Honestly, I'm okay with it. I really am, because I guess I just feel like well, I don't know the demographics of that school. I know the demographics of Alexandria High School, and there's no majority population in that high school. There's like, it's like literally 30% white, 30% African American, 30% Hispanic, and then other people of other ethnicities or whatever. And so for me, I was like, it totally makes sense to me that we're going to change the name of that school, because the person it's named after would not recognize 2/3 of the kids in that school as humans. And I mean, I think you could probably make the same argument about George Mason. I think because history is messy, because people were both the writers of, like Thomas Jefferson wrote fantastic documents that are flexible and words to live by, and he was a slaveholder. Like, I think the mistake we make is to turn them into heroes and to make them infallible, because actually that is not a good model for anyone to have. Good models for people to have are, you can still accomplish tremendous things and also do things that you're not so proud of. And I think if we could talk more honestly about the complexity of history, that would actually be more beneficial. So to me, the naming, again, I'm speaking just as myself, like, is not a thing that I'm willing to, it's not the hill I want to climb on. And what's the hill? Not the hill I want to die on. Like, if the vote is to change the name, I say we change the name.
Well, the citizens actually voted overwhelmingly not to change the name. And demographics wise, it's also by far majority white. My kids go there. My kids have raised the issue of, well, the school's name is well known, around the country. To say you're a graduate there, that means something. And I'm like, well, big deal. You could simply say that the school that used to be known that. I mean, college, if your biggest issue with it is college recruiters, they'll figure it out immediately, right? I mean, that's not really an issue. But it's just been interesting to see kind of a really underground backlash against the renaming. There are signs popping up all over town, opposing the renaming, even though it is a done deal. So I just wonder how that plays in.
I mean, I think that's really interesting, and that could be a thing to have a really interesting dialogue about. It really could be, because I think once you get past the yes, no, we should do it, we shouldn't do it, then it's kind of interesting to ask people to share their, why. What is your personal truth here that you want to hold on to? What's the social truth that is kind of upsetting to you? What are the facts of the situation? And can we just come to some kind of peace about the fact that this is happening? So.
Public dialogue, always good.
Dialogue, always good.
Yeah, a couple people have chimed in and said that the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated in 1922. So,
I knew it was like 22, 25, somewhere in there. Yeah.
But so they started building it during World War I. Okay. Let's see. Matthew S. What are your feelings about the movement to remove all Confederate monuments from federal lands, including from Civil War battlefields?
Again, I think that the important thing to do here is to sort of figure out what is the monument doing on that space. That, that is truly public space, public lands. It's supposed to be about interpretation of history, not necessarily memorializing of heroic figures. So, what is the function of the memorial on those spaces, I think, is an important question to ask. I think the other thing that I think about as a public historian who loves the Park Service and wrote about the Park Service is that the demographics of visitors to museums, to monuments, to all these things is actually not so terrific. So like, there's whole groups of people who don't visit those places. And I think it might be an opportunity to, as part of this question, to figure out who feels welcome and doesn't feel welcome and why. who thinks particular stories are about them or not about them, or who thinks their experiences are invalid and why? And are the memorials doing the work to mark that boundary? And if they're not, okay. But I think it's, again, I don't know that it's such an easy question of like, do it or don't do it. I think it really requires this kind of assessment of why is it there? What work is it doing? Is it a barrier to other visitors? Is it challenging some people's experiences? And what can you do to change that dynamic?
Right. Permanence is a problem, as you said.
Permanence, this is my new thing, that I actually think that permanence and institutionalization can be a problem.
Yeah. Okay, Eric Nichols asks, would it be fair to say that a major reason for installing Confederate memorials was to intimidate African Americans during Jim Crow, rather than commemorating the Confederate leaders?
Easy one, yes. Yes, I think that's very fair to say. It's, you know, as part of the process of advancing the lost cause mythology that was done in order to legitimize the kind of states' rights way of life and legitimize Jim Crow. Like, yes.
Yeah. Rod Mackler points out that some commercial statue makers sold the same statue as both Union and Confederate soldiers.
Yes, exactly. It's funny because someone asked me once, like, well, but I mean, shouldn't these things, they're like art, they're public art, shouldn't they be in museums? I'm like, I don't know how much public art they are. They were mass produced. It was like the same statue over and over again in a lot of places. Yeah, that's really true.
It's funny. Jerry Laporte says the U.S. Grant Memorial in front of the U.S. Capitol at the foot of Capitol Hill was dedicated in 1922 and is the largest equestrian statue in the United States. FYI. Let's see. Someone responded. There were some who wanted the Grant Memorial to be located where the Lincoln Memorial is now. As a way to stare down the South and remind it who won.
Well, and it's funny because if you notice the way the Lincoln Memorial is positioned, his back is to Lee. So, I mean, there's like, it actually was positioned as part of the like reunification, because it's like his back's to Lee's mansion and the bridge is between them. So it's like a gesture of mutual sorrow or something. So yeah, the symbolism of its position is really important too.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to do one more question. We have so many, but I think maybe we can open it up after this a little bit and people can unmute. But this is an interesting question by Dave Morgan. He says, what impact do private entities like Colonial Williamsburg or Mount Vernon, which are driven by revenues and profits, have on public history?
How much time do you have? So
if it's too complex, you can just.
The short answer actually is that Mount Vernon is actually the very first, I think it's the very first. I think your audience is like fact checking me, good for that. But Mount Vernon, like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, is often identified as the origin point for preservation activity in the US. So, and a lot of people followed that model of like a friends group, you know, like the Mount Vernon Ladies Association preserving historic places. And then Colonial Williamsburg was on the leading edge of doing more audience-centered interpretation, as opposed to just preserving the place and you think that it will inspire people, kind of like a memorial, just by its mere presence. Colonial Williamsburg really started thinking about interpretation as a profession. So they're both very influential in the history of the profession, if that makes any sense.
Okay. All right, people, if you have questions, feel free to unmute, but try not to talk over each other if there are a lot. And Denise, before people do, thank you so much. This was a fabulous talk tonight.
Thank you so much.
I really learned a lot.
I appreciate you asking me. It was fun. Except I wish I was actually seeing everyone instead of just names.
I want to echo Jessica as a thank you. We really appreciate it. But before we take any more questions, Jessica, can you just really quickly remind people of the next
Oh,
event?
sure. Next month, we are going to be having Dale Smith, and he used to be the head of Arlington's fire department, and he's writing a book on Fire Station 8. And he's got a lot of new sources and things that he's found to add to what's been written about Fire Station 8 already. So I think it'll be a fabulous talk, and I hope you all can join us.
Registration will be through our social media, and it will be on our website also. All right, at this point, if you want to unmute, if you have any additional questions, we have a few more minutes.
Well, I had one question. May I ask?
Yes,
Max
please.
first?
Yeah.
Yes, when this controversy about monuments emerged a few years ago, I've been a Civil War buff for a good share of my adult life, at least since I moved to Washington. My initial reaction was that the monuments were a way of sort of healing the wounds of the Civil War. Northerners respect Southern monuments, and Southerners respect Northern monuments, I hope. I have visited many, and so I was a bit disturbed. I understand that, I mean, the Civil War was fundamentally a war between whites, and blacks were the subject of the the object of the war. And I understand why that can be, I understand that perspective, but in a way, tearing down monuments is creating some bitterness and upset that I wonder if it's really healthy.
If I may.
Yes, please.
African Americans were not only the sort of passive recipients of the war. African Americans had been leading abolition for decades, centuries, like since the start of slavery. African Americans had been actively pushing for abolition of slavery through violent means, through peaceful means, through protests. There were free Black communities. African Americans were also soldiers in the war because they recognized that this was crucial to their well-being. Aside from that, Edward T. Linenthal, again, one of my history heroes, has written it's an old book now called Americans and Their, it's called Sacred Ground, Americans and Their Battlefields. And what he says, he's not the only one, but it's like a very readable way to get to this, is that you're right that sort of monument building and these ceremonies at battlefields with the veterans over the course of 75 years after the war was about healing the wounds, but it was only about healing the wounds between white people. And you can actually track that at the start of those events, there was much more recognition of African-American contributions to the war and slavery as the cause and abolition and all that stuff. And by the 50-year mark, they become these symbolic, literally like veterans shaking hands across the wall at Gettysburg, stuff like that. And so it's not a just peace. It's not a just peace. It's a peace that's grounded in forgetting and a willful disavowal of what the war ultimately could have been about. And so the reason there's controversy is because these things are unresolved. And I kind of started by saying, and I really believe this to be true, that there's no peace, there's no unity without truth telling. And those memorials are not truth tellers. So I think you're right that they represent like unity, North and South, white and white, reunifying a white nation, but that's not a just peace.
That's a good answer, I think. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
If we don't have, I'm going to turn my video on. If we don't have any more questions, then we really thank you, Denise, for
Thank
your
you.
time. Jessica, did you have anything else that you needed to add?
I don't. Just everybody have a great evening.
Thank you so much. We appreciate all your time tonight and attending our events, and we hope to see you in the future. And thank you, Denise. It was really a riveting presentation tonight and really gave, I hope, I know me, but hopefully a lot of people food for thought.
Thank you. It's great to see everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye.